Hi, Kevin Douglas here. If you follow my YouTube channel, you've probably noticed that I try to play a lot of different decks in Vintage, but I tend to play Merfolk the most. Since Vintage doesn't really have a source of deck text or primers like Modern does with MTG Salvation or Legacy does with MTG as a source, I haven't really found any in-depth deck texts or primers for Merfolk. So I figured I'd put something together since I've gained some familiarity with the deck since I picked it up last fall. And since then I've kind of cashed in a few dailies on MTGO. So I kind of feel like I have a little bit of understanding how to play the deck. So feel free to post in the comments or hit me up on Twitter if you have any feedback, questions, or concerns. So to get started, I'll just kind of quickly introduce the deck. Merfolk is one of Vintage's Null Rod decks. Sometimes they call it Fish, but in general it's just a well-rounded mix of mana denial, free counter spells, and of course cheap synergistic Merfolk. So it also runs like Wasteland, Cavern of Souls, Force of Will, main board Null Rod that all have a lot of game against the majority of decks in the format. So in general, the way you play Merfolk is you use Wasteland and Null Rod early in the game to kind of slow your opponents down, along with Force of Will and Mental Misstep to kind of do the same thing and gain tempo. And then you just play a bunch of cheap Merfolk that can quickly grow into big threats, and those turn into like a quick and evasive clock. So in terms of sideboarding, it's kind of limited to blue spells, obviously because it's a mono blue deck. But there's also some spells that use Phyrexian mana, like Dismember, some lands like Ghost Quarter, and of course artifacts like Grafdigger's Cage, Tormod's Crypt, and so forth and so on. So kind of moving on, to kind of outline this deck tech, you can see we're going to start with building the deck. And so we're going to identify the core cards. We're going to talk about some of the flex spots, and then talk about sideboarding. After that, I'll kind of go into detail about playing the deck, some tips and stuff that I've learned from my time with the deck, and then I'll talk about the matchup analysis for what I've noticed are kind of some of the more common decks you'll run into, at least on MTGO. And then we'll go into some of the personal results that I've had with the deck. Just to kind of gain insight into some things like how the deck mulligans, its win percentages, stuff like that. So starting with the main board, you can see here that I kind of have the subtitle Data-Driven Deck Building. So what that means is that what I did was use all the data that I had available from the past couple of years on Merfolk to try to figure out what is the core of the deck. What cards do people normally include? What cards do people normally not include? How does sideboarding look? Vintage can kind of be a slow-moving format, so data from 2 years ago, 2015, even can still be relevant, especially if a deck hasn't changed very much since that time. So the methodology for this data was I found deck lists to build the data set. I found them on tcdex.net, MTG Top 8, looked on Goldfish, didn't really find any. When I accessed this data, it was early in the year, so it's possible that a couple more decks have shown up, but kind of based on what I saw in the decks that I was able to find, those 25 decks, a lot of them, there hasn't been much change to the deck in the last 2 years. And so I'm confident that even if I missed a few of the more recent decks, they probably look pretty similar to the ones that I used. So using all that data, what I did was compile a list of every unique card in the main board and sideboard and kind of put it in an Excel spreadsheet and use that to generate some statistics like what percent of decks ran the card, what was the mean value of the number of that particular card they ran, and what was the median and what was the mode. So all those statistics are just kind of meant to give us an idea of how many cards we should include in what we're kind of going to call like the general build of Merfolk, which we'll use as like a good starting point for the deck. So moving on to actually building the deck, we can take a look at the core creatures. So you can see here that there's a table where all the creatures from our data set are kind of listed in order from the percent that they've been included in those decks that we found. And you can see that there are several creatures that are just in every single deck. Those are going to be core cards. And then there are creatures that are included in most of the decks. And then there's some that are included in not very many of the decks. So using that, we can kind of start building our creature base. So, of course, if you play Merfolk, or if you've heard of Merfolk, Lord of Atlantis instantly comes to mind. So what we have are these two lords, Lord of Atlantis and Master of the Pearl Trident, that give all of our Merfolk +1/+1 and Island Walk. So in a format like Vintage that skews so heavily towards blue, many decks are running Island. So these instantly are valuable because they make sure that your creatures can't be blocked. So if we kind of look at Master of the Pearl Trident, only 96% of the decks in our deck lists ran them, but I'm pretty sure that that's probably an error, or maybe just like it was a paper tournament, they didn't have them in paper or something, so they really should be included in all the decks. Next, we can kind of start looking at some of the more value creatures. Curse Catcher, we have is a 1-drop, 1/1, but with the ability to sacrifice and counter a target instant or sorcery spell unless its controller plays 1. So by playing Curse Catcher, you can slow decks down a little bit. If they want to resolve a key spell, they need to make sure they have the extra mana to pay for it. And sometimes, if people are playing a little bit loose, they just forget about it, and they'll go in for a key spell, not have mana up, and you can catch them with the Curse Catcher. Next is the Silvergill Adept. It's a 2/1 for 2, but with the additional requirement that you have to reveal a Merfolk from your hand to play it, or else you have to pay 3 additional mana. In a deck that runs so many Merfolk, that doesn't usually come up, or at least it doesn't come up very often, and it has the extra benefit of when you play it, you get to draw a card. And that's super powerful in this deck because besides Ancestral Recall, you don't really have much of a draw engine. So by being able to play a 2/1 creature for 2 that also draws you a card, that's just an incredible amount of value, especially considering that it's going to grow bigger than a 2/1 if you get any Lords in play. Moving kind of on to our 3-drop spot, I think one of the main benefits of running this deck is because True Name Nemesis fits into it so well. True Name Nemesis is a Merfolk. When it comes into play, you choose a player, and it has protection from that player. What that means is it can't be blocked, targeted, dealt damage, or enchanted by anything controlled by that player. So in formats that run cards like Swords of the Plowshares or Jace the Mind Sculptor, all those require you to target these creatures. And a lot of decks rely on those cards to kind of control the board. So sometimes just landing a True Name Nemesis can just win the game by itself because there aren't many answers to it in the format. So, and then finally, we kind of round our creatures out with Phantasmal Image. It's not a Merfolk, but it's good enough to include this deck because what it is a 2-drop that becomes a copy of any creature in play when you play it. It does have the drawback of if it's ever targeted by anything, you have to sacrifice it, but it's a super powerful ability and worth playing because you have almost all of your other creatures are all good targets most of the time. So there are times where you want to copy a Curse Catcher to, if you're playing like a Storm deck and you want to prevent them from storming off. If you need extra card draw, you can target a Silvergill Adept. If it's a deck that you don't have to worry about them comboing off, it's more like a fair deck, you can copy a True Name Nemesis, and then it can never be targeted anyway, so you never have to sacrifice it. If you're just trying to close the game, you can copy one of your Lords, and it becomes, it puts another Lord effect on the board. It's just super versatile, and even has the added benefit of sometimes being able to copy your opponent's creatures. So if your opponent happens to tinker a Blightsteel Colossus into play, for instance, you might be able to Phantasmal Image that and have an answer for it that you might not have had otherwise. So with those creatures, what we see is that that's kind of the core of our deck. All the other creatures that were in the top 10 of the decks that we looked at are at like 40%, 24%. So most decks don't actually run those other creatures, whereas almost all the decks run the creatures that we identified. So you can kind of see at the side here, we have those statistics that'll kind of tell us how many of each copy to run. So you can see most of them are 4-drops. Phantasmal Image is a 3, or 4 of. Phantasmal Image is a 3 of. And I think it's pretty consistent across the board up till True Name Nemesis. You see the mean is actually at 3.2%, but the mode is 4. So that means that more people are playing 4 than anything, any other number. But because the mean is 3, it tells us that some decks are running like 1 or 2. Personally, I think that the card is strong enough that it should be an auto 4 of. It just wins the game on its own sometimes. It's really hard to answer. I think it's one of the best reasons to play Merfolk, actually. So I'm going to go ahead and say that we should probably run 4 of those. So moving on from the core creatures, we can take a look at the core spells. So again, we have a list of the top 10 spells that were in our data set based on the number of decks they appeared in. And we can see that, kind of like our creatures, we have several spells that are pretty much just an auto inclusion for our Merfolk deck, ranging from like 100% down to 88% at that Black Lotus. And kind of like I mentioned earlier, Black Lotus at 88%, I'm pretty sure is just from like sanctioned paper results where somebody might not have had a Black Lotus and didn't include it because it's very powerful. Same thing with Mox Sapphire, same thing with Time Walk, same thing with Ancestral Recall. All of those should just be auto includes. So we kind of go through these cards. We see Force of Will. This is what Force of Will is, the necessary evil of the format. It helps keep all the degenerate combo decks in check, prevents anything too broken from happening too often. And because we're a blue deck, we're able to easily fit it into our strategy. Kind of same thing with Mental Misstep. Mental Misstep is kind of one of those cards that tons of decks run. Not every deck needs it, but I think in a tempo deck, and especially a creature-based one that can be soft to things like Pyroblast or Swords to Plowshares, or can get behind in card advantage, it's really important to have your Mental Missteps to kind of counter those spells, counter an Ancestral Recall, kind of gain that tempo. So especially since I've been seeing Fatal Push kind of become a little more popular in the format, it's just another one CMC card that our deck kind of needs to answer. So moving on from the counter spells, we have Ancestral Recall, of course, one of our few sources of card advantage. Time Walk. It's not uncommon to win the game by putting on a Lord, attacking with a team, time walking, and then closing the game out. We have Black Lotus and Mox Sapphire. Those are kind of our mana acceleration. Being able to play a True Name Nemesis on turn 1, or sometimes even like a Silver Gull Adept and then a Lord. Those can just be super fast starts that are hard for your opponent to answer, especially if they're a fair deck. And then Null Rod. So I kind of mentioned earlier that Merfolk is considered a Null Rod deck. And what that means is that a lot of decks, if they aren't like a broken combo deck, they become kind of like a Null Rod deck because Vintage as a format is kind of, all of these decks run these really powerful artifacts like Black Lotus and the Mox and stuff like Time Vault and Voltaic Key. And Shops is popular, so you have Arcbound Ravager and Ballista. Well, being able to mainboard a Null Rod kind of prevents a lot of decks from doing what they were designed to do, and so it's often powerful enough to just win a game on its own. This is especially the case recently since Paradoxical Outcome has become more popular. That deck in particular relies on a lot of 0 or 1 CMC artifacts, mana acceleration, that they kind of empty their hand out, play a Paradoxical Outcome, and then get to play them all again after generating mana from them. Well, if you play Null Rod, it prevents them from being able to have the mana or ability to really combo off. And so often just the Null Rod by itself is enough to win the game against a lot of those types of decks, which are becoming more popular. So after Null Rod, we see that the cards that we have left in this list top off at Flusterstorm at 64%. So there's kind of a clear division between, everything above it that's, 90% to 100%. And then we kind of get down to Flusterstorm where just over like half decks are running it. So I'm not really going to consider that a core card in our deck right now. I'm going to kind of leave that for our flex spot. So these would be our core spells. Of course, after creatures and spells, so we have, again, just kind of the statistics. They tell us how many of each card we're going to run based on what, our data set tells us. And we see that, as we kind of expect, Force of Will is a 4 of, Mental Missteps a 3 of. Again, it's a very strong card, but it's also situational, so you might not want to have too many of them in your hand. And then, of course, we have our restricted cards and Ancestral Recall, Time Walk, Sapphire, Black Lotus. And then we have Null Rod, which, as powerful as it is, you only need 1 in play. Any other copies are redundant, and we don't really have anything we want to do with extra artifacts like Thirst for Knowledge where we could discard it or anything like that. So we don't want to draw too many of them, but we want to see it in a good number of our games. So for Null Rod, we're going to run 3. So of course, after our creatures and spells, we have to talk about lands. Being a mono blue deck, our mana base is pretty simple. You can see that the majority of decks are running around 10 islands. And then because we are a tribal deck, we have the benefit of being able to run Cavern of Souls in a full playset of those. And Cavern of Souls in Vintage can be very powerful because a lot of decks are running counter magic. So Force of Will, Mana Drain is becoming a little more popular. Cards like that that could answer our creatures 1-for-1 now just kind of become dead cards in our opponent's hand. And of course, being a Null Rod deck with cheap creatures, we also, as part of our mana denial strategy, run Strip Mine and Wasteland. A few decks, I think maybe 1 or 2, actually ran Mutavault. Being a tribal deck, sometimes Mutavault is a very powerful card. If you play Merfolk in Modern, you kind of know what I'm talking about. It just becomes another beater. It survives a board wipe on your opponent's turn, but in this deck, it's not quite as good because unlike those other formats where a lot of games are won by amassing a bunch of creatures and attacking in, Vintage is a format where it's often enough just to have a couple creatures in play. And so it's good. It's a good strategy to be leaving mana up to cast your counter spells and answer your opponent's threats once you do happen to get a couple creatures in play. And Mutavault is very expensive. It costs basically 2 mana to use since it itself is a land. If you want to attack with it, you can't tap it for mana. And if you want to activate it, you have to spend another 1 of your mana to do that. And then it doesn't tap for blue. And a lot of our spells have a double blue requirement or a single blue requirement. So sometimes it's just this card isn't really worth the that negative of not tapping for blue and requiring so much mana to use. So looking at the statistics, I kind of mentioned earlier, it looks like most decks run around 10 islands, of course, and then max out on play sets of Cavern of Souls and then the 1 Strip Mine. And that puts us at 19 land. And so with Black Lotus and Mox Sapphire, that gives us 21 mana sources in the deck, which is actually quite a bit for Vintage. But since we want to be spending our Wastelands and Strip Mine to limit our opponent's mana, it's good to have some extra mana sources in there to make sure that we ourselves are not too limited on mana. Okay, so now we've identified like the creatures, the spells, the lands, we can kind of see what our main board looks like. So we started off with our islands, we had our playsets of Cavern of Souls, our Wastelands, and our Strip Mine. And so that's sort of our mana base. And we can start adding in our mana acceleration. We see that we run our 3 Null Rods, then Ancestral Recall and Time Walk, sort of our value cards. Force of Will and Mental Missteps. Those are our interaction with our opponent. Those prevent us from losing to anything too broken and trying to keep the game more fair. And then comes our creatures. So Lord of Atlantis, Master Pearl Trident, there's our lords. We have Curse Catcher and Silvergill Adept. They're sort of our value creatures. We have True Name Nemesis, which closes our games out. It's just a super powerful card. And then our Phantasmal Image, which again is just sort of toolboxy. It's kind of situational. It can copy any one of our Merfolk. Sometimes it can copy your opponent's creatures. And then that leaves us with just 4 spots in this deck. So this combined is 56 cards. And so this is what we've identified as our core deck, which means that if you were going to build a Merfolk deck from scratch and you didn't really, you weren't familiar with the meta, or you just kind of wanted a solid pile to start playing with as you kind of learn the format, this would be a really good starting point. This is what a lot of people have kind of been successful with. And so it's not meant to really be like the end-all only way to play Merfolk, but this should be a very good starting point, a very good base to build from. And so we have 4 more cards to add, and so those would be our flex spots. And of course, flex spots are going to depend on the metagame, but these are the top 10 cards that everybody else was included in their decks. So basically in that data set that I showed earlier, I took all the cards that we haven't already included in the deck and then ranked them from the percentage of decks they've been running. And so one thing that jumps out at me is besides Fluster Storm, which is at 64%, which means that it's running just over half of the decks as a flex card, all the other cards are, 44% in the 20s, in the teens, and that tells me that, there's a wide variety of flex cards that people are including in their main boards, which, makes sense because if they were more popular, then they probably would have fallen under our like core card definition. But, there's a lot of different ways to build your Merfolk deck to kind of answer your particular meta. And so if we kind of take a look at some of these, we see Flusterstorm and Misdirection and Daze, some additional counter magic. We see Mara Regery, Harbinger of the Tides, Waterfront Bouncer. So there's some different types of creatures that people add in their decks sometimes. Dismember, Echoing Truth, Steel Sabotage. There's some answers to cards that might be popular in the format. Lotus Petal for some mana acceleration. So there's kind of a lot of options to choose from as you're looking at these flex spots. But as I kind of mentioned earlier, it's going to depend on your meta. So if we take a look at what the meta game looks like right now, I mostly play on MTGO. And so my meta might be kind of skewed because it could be a little bit different in paper. But basically, for me, this is what I would look like when I'm choosing my flex cards. And so I accessed this morning, May 21st, 2017, and we see that according to MTG Goldfish, which is where I got this data, Shops is 15% of the meta, followed by Mentor at 13%. And then what Goldfish is calling blue-white control is at 11%. This actually kind of looks just like that drawer in your kitchen where you just put everything else that doesn't fit. This blue-white control looks like it fits a bunch of different strategies. There's a couple of decks that run Mentor as a 1 or 2 of, but in general, they look like blue-based control decks. Almost all of them are running Paradoxical Outcome for card draw, but no Tendrils of Agony or anything for Storm. And so they're basically just control decks. They build a bunch of card advantage, control the game, control the board, and then either win from Mentor or I think I've seen some running Emrakul, not the 15 drop, but the I think the Living End. So that deck's kind of popular, but it's not a really well-defined archetype, and so it might kind of fit in some other places. But in general, it's kind of going to be like big blue control. The next most popular deck, Blue-Red Delver. This one is actually kind of a recent appearance. This wasn't on the list, a couple months ago. Basically, with the printing of Harsh Mentor, we've seen and the restriction of Gush, probably especially, we've seen this deck crop up that's a Delver deck, but it also runs like a play set of Eidolon of the Great Revel, Harsh Mentor, Scab Clan, Berserker, basically a bunch of cards that are aggressive creature based, but also happen to interact with your opponent in a way that sort of nullifies what your opponent's deck wants to do. So they deal damage to your opponent for playing cheap spells. And in Vintage, a lot of decks rely on playing a high density of cheap spells. And so these decks are able to sort of get under those decks and sort of punish them for playing all these cheap cantrips and everything and mocks. And they win in that way. So kind of cool to see that crop up. Next we have Oath at 7%. This is sort of all, I believe, varieties of Oath, followed by Eldrazi. And so these are kind of the top 6. And Eldrazi would be like the mono white, sort of like Eldrazi and Taxes, or like I think I've seen it called like Displacer and Taxes, or but basically runs Eldrazi Displacer, Containment Priest, Eldrazi like Thought Not Seer and Reality Smasher, and also kind of has like a prison element to it, and so it can be very fast with all of the soul lands that it plays. While also, has a really strong mana denial. plan. So that deck's definitely gaining in popularity since it came out. And so if we look at the totals here, that's 63% of the online meta. And so it's definitely not all of the decks, and some of these archetypes might be a little bit ill-defined, like shops. There's a couple different ways to build shops and a couple different ways to build mentor, but and a couple different ways to build oath. But kind of in general as archetypes, these are kind of what you would expect to see, at least if you're going to go into a daily event. So this is what we want to kind of base our flex cards around. And so if we go back to that list of common flex cards, what we can kind of see here on the right is some cards I've chosen out of this pile are Flusterstorm, Echoing Truth, Dismember, and Mental Misstep. If you remember, we were 4 cards short. And so those would be the 4 cards that I would pick out of these flex cards if I was going to build a deck right now. Flusterstorm is just a really good answer to all of the control decks running around. You're able to leave it up. It's pretty cheap at 1 mana. And it can often help you resolve that critical lord you need to resolve, a true name nemesis. It's very, very good against Storm, so if you're able to kind of hold on to it until they play Tendrils, then you're able to sort of waste everything they've done up to that point in that turn and make them start over, or more likely probably just go to the next game. Mental Misstep, I like having all 4 mental missteps. I kind of mentioned sometimes it's not good, it's a situational card. But I think in a tempo deck and in a meta where you have like Mentor and Delver that are so popular, it's good to have all those main board mental missteps, even if Shops is the most popular deck, because you can always side it out and kind of improve your deck post board. And then Dismember, again, Mentor is a very popular deck. We see Eldrazi, we see Delver. There's a lot of creature decks right now that are relevant. And Dismember at least gives you 1 main board answer to troubling permanent like Monastery Mentor, which our deck can sometimes struggle to answer. So kind of adding those in, we see that we have our main board here. And I mentioned earlier that, again, this isn't the end-all way of building this deck, but it should be a good place to start if you're starting out with Merfolk. This is actually the version that I've been playing for a while online now, and despite some of the meta changes and things that we've seen happening in the format, I still think it's a very strong main board. So of course, now that we have our main board identified, we're gonna have to figure out a sideboard. So when we talk about sideboarding, what we really want to talk about is making your bad matchups better. So sometimes people kind of fall into the trap of just looking and seeing what's popular in the format and just building their sideboard to what's the most popular decks. But if you already have, a good match win percentage against a particular deck, you don't need to devote as much, sideboard slots to that. And so what we want to do is kind of go back and look again at our meta. First, I just kind of have a list here of all these sideboard cards. So again, this is from that data set of all those 25 decks that I was able to find. These are all the sideboard cards that showed up. And so you can see there's a huge diversity of sideboard cards. And again, this is, it might look like a lot, but we're pretty limited in our sideboard options because we're a blue-based deck, no access to other colors in general. And so it's going to be limited to blue spells, spells with Phyrexian mana, artifacts, and lands. And so a lot to choose from. It's going to be very meta dependent. And so, excuse me. And so if we rank them from the most popular, though, we can see that there are some sideboard options that seem to make it into every Merfolk deck, sort of regardless of the meta. My data set was pulled from a period of 2 years, 2015 and 2016, with there may have been 1 or 2 2017 results, but for the most part, over that 2-year span, almost everyone was running Grafdigger's Cages or Hurkyl's Recall or Steel Sabotage or Dismember in some number. And so Dismember at 84%. The next highest is Tormod's Crypt at 48%. So kind of a big difference here between these top 4 and everything else. And so kind of like when we identified our core sideboard cards, we're going to want to look at those cards and see what makes them so good in Merfolk, and you know, it's likely that they're going to end up in our sideboard. So there's those kind of cards highlighted. Grafdigger's Cage. So if we look at Grafdigger's Cage, creature cards can't enter the battlefield from graveyards or libraries, and cards can't be cast from graveyards or libraries. So this is especially important because we are a creature-based deck, and being blue, we don't have a good way of permanently getting rid of non-creature permanents. And so if Oath is very popular in the format, we don't really have much of an answer to it, except now if you have Grafdigger's Cage. Because basically they're not able to put a creature into play from their Oath of Druids trigger, and so they have to find an answer to your Grafdigger's Cage first. And so it's very cheap. You can get into play on turn 1, hopefully before your opponent's able to get an Oath in. Merfolk can also be, it's also difficult to beat Dredge without Dredge hate. You know, a lot of decks have that problem, and so Grafdigger's Cage is one of our main answers to Dredge as well. Hurkyl's Recall. If Shops is very popular, Shops can be a troubling deck. It's not unwinnable by any means, but because they're able to establish like a mana denial strategy so quickly with cards like Trinisphere, Sphere Resistance, all that sort of thing, it can be kind of hard to get under them. And sometimes you can find yourself just locked out of the game very quickly. And so Hurkyl's Recall is sort of like a reset button. Sometimes you can wait, you know, several turns, try to get some stuff into play, but let them amass like a large board presence, and then hopefully have enough mana at the end of a turn to Hurkyl's Recall and sort of reset their board, and then deploy all of your cheap threats, hopefully before they're start turning the tide to become the aggressor. And so Hurkyl's Recall is a good answer for Shops. It's also a good answer for, well, maybe not a good answer, but it can be an answer to the Paradoxical Outcome decks. Paradoxical Outcome targets all of these permanents, but it doesn't actually return them to your hand until the spell resolves, and you only draw a card if you return them to your hand. So depending if you want to bring them in against those sort of Paradoxical Outcome like Storm decks, what you can do is wait for them to cast Paradoxical Outcome, target all of their mana rocks, and then you return them to their hand, and they don't get to draw any cards off of them. And so it's like a pseudo counter spell for their Paradoxical Outcome. So I want to bring it in against like just the control decks using Paradoxical Outcome just for card draw, but I probably would bring it in against a Storm deck that's kind of all in on, you know, that one big turn generating Storm and killing you, because you don't have to deploy, you don't have to have a ton of threats in those sorts of matchups. You know, you don't have to race. As long as you can just prevent them from storming out, you can take your time to you know, just get that incremental damage in, and then win the game. Next one, Steel Sabotage. I'm liking this card a little bit more now that Shops is running Walking Ballista. A resolved Walking Ballista can be extremely difficult to deal with because even if you were able to you know, bounce it or dismember it, they can, in response, you know, clear your board. So you know, if they wipe out a Lord, give everything a little bit less toughness, then they're able to wipe out another Lord. You know, you can go from having a very imposing board state to almost nothing with a single resolved Ballista. So it's good to have a way to fight that on the stack, as well as some of the lock pieces like Trinisphere or, you know, like a Lodestone Golem or something like that. So Steel Sabotage, it's good against Shops, which is one of the most popular decks, and specifically against cards like Ballista that we have trouble with. But it's also very good in other matchups, like decks that would run the Time Vault Voltaic Key combo. It's a way to break up that interaction. And so I like it because it's a general purpose card with you know, a lot of game against particular decks in the format. You know, I would even bring it against Storm possibly to, you know, try to counter like a Mana Vault. So And then of course Dismember. I like having more than one Dismember. If you remember, I have one copy as a flex spot, but in a format where Mentor is so popular, not even just in a Mentor deck, but you know, it's powerful enough that you see people adding it into their Storm decks. You know, you kind of sometimes see it in like a Landstill deck. It's just a super powerful card that's very difficult for Merfolk to answer because it generates a ton of blockers. If they, you know, target your lords and remove them, then you can't get through them, and then the threat just grows so big so quickly that we don't really have an answer for that. And so Dismember is one of our best ways to answer Mentor. And so I think in this particular meta, it's incredibly important to have more of those in your sideboard. So again, just kind of looking at those numbers, we see Grafdigger's Cage is a 4 of. If we look at the mode column, Hurkyl's Recall, you know, most decks included 1 or 2 copies. Steel Sabotage, most decks included 3. Dismember, again, most decks included 3, so that gives us the full play set, including the one on our main board. And so again, if we look at our meta, you know, what sideboard cards you choose should probably depend on your meta, and in particular, what decks you are soft against. And so if you kind of look at this, you know, Merfolk being a fair deck, it's actually kind of even to unfavored against a lot of decks, or just slightly or slightly favored against decks. There aren't a whole lot of matchups that Merfolk is like a heavy favorite against. Maybe Storm, because you're able to mainboard Null Rod and you have so much counter magic in your 75. But besides that, most decks are pretty fair matchups and kind of border around that even. You know, although like I mentioned, some are, you know, like Oath or Mentor, probably more on the unfavored spectrum. So knowing that, if we look at our sideboard, for Grafdigger's Cages, you have to have Dredge Hate, and because our deck is so soft to Oath of Druids, we need to have all those answers to Oath of Druids. Same thing, so Hurkyl's Recall, Shops is the most important, or I should say is the most popular deck in the format right now, and it's not a great matchup for us. In fact, in my experience, we're probably slightly unfavored. So having an answer in Hurkyl's Recall is good, as well as kind of having game against like those all-in Storm decks, you know, based around like Paradoxical Outcome. Dismember, I mentioned Mentor is a super powerful card. It's sort of taken over Vintage and is played in the second most popular deck, Mentor deck, as well as it shows up in other decks like Storm, like Landstill. And there aren't very many good answers for it in Merfolk, and so Dismember kind of is our answer. Steel Sabotage, you know, this gives us a way to fight Walking Ballista on the stack. It gives us a way to handle like the Grixis Thieves sorts of deck that run the Time Vault Voltaic Key combo. It's a way for us to, you know, kill a permanent on the board that could give us trouble, like, you know, if somebody's playing Ratchet Bomb or Engineered Explosives and didn't lead mana up. It could be a way to either try to counter that on the stack or get rid of it before they're able to use it. It's just kind of a good all-around card. Tormod's Crypt, I mentioned having a good amount of Dredge Hate. Tormod's Crypt is 0 CMC, so you're able to play it on your first turn, and you're able to crack it at instant speed. And so against Dredge, it's just another answer. And so whether you include it or not sort of depends on the meta. I kind of have it in here as like a general card that a lot of, you know, builds want to include. You know, I like having a good amount of Dredge Hate. But I can see particular metas, especially if Dredge isn't very popular, where you wouldn't want to include it. But, you know, if Dredge is popular and if like Dark Petition Storm is popular, then, you know, it's not a bad card to have around. And then finally, there's one copy of Ghost Quarter. That's also kind of a hedge against Dredge. It's a hedge against Shops. You're able to you know, you have one more mana source to try to get around their mana denial. If you need to, you can hit a Mishra's Workshop. If you're playing, you know, Landstill, it's an answer for Mishra's Factory. So again, just kind of a good all-around card that is strong against several matchups. So here's our 75. I've kind of mentioned a few times, but this is just a general strategy. It's not meant to be like the definitive Merfolk deck. I've just found, and I think that based off the data, this would just be like a really good place to start if you're interested in playing Merfolk. So now we've kind of identified the deck, we can talk about playing the deck. So I'll just kind of go through some of the tips that I've learned while playing the deck, and then just go through some of the more popular matchups on MTGO that I've noticed since I've been playing, and then just talk about some of the results I've had and try to gain some insight from that data that I've happened to generate from my matches. So kind of going through the tips, what I've found is that the deck mulligan's okay, at least to 1, at least going down to 6. You have a lot of redundancy. You know, we're not dependent on any combo. We're a fair deck. We have a lot of creatures, and so basically as long as you have 2 mana sources and a couple of Merfolk, your hand's probably okay. And so I definitely would say don't be afraid to mulligan with this deck. You can kind of evaluate if your hand is strong enough to win, and if not, you know, don't be afraid to find a better one. At the beginning of the game, use your Wastelands and Null Rod first. You know, I've been caught a couple times like thinking I need to build a clock and having the choice between playing a Lord and a Null Rod, and I choose to play the Lord, and then I get comboed out the next turn. And so in general, I've found that if you have a mana denial strategy, it's usually best to put that into place as early as possible. So unless you absolutely need to use that Wasteland to cast your spells, unless you absolutely have to do something other than Null Rod, it's usually the right call to, you know, Wasteland, strip mine lands early, and try to get that Null Rod into place if it's a deck that you know can be soft against Null Rod. Next one is be mindful of having a Merfolk to cast Silvergill Adept. So I kind of mentioned Silvergill Adept is a 2-drop, but it has that requirement that to pay, you have to reveal another Merfolk from your hand when you play it, otherwise you have to pay an extra 3 mana. So just be mindful sometimes of your that Silvergill Adept requirement. And so sometimes you might want to run a Lord out first, but if your hand only has a Lord and a Silvergill Adept, you might want to run that Silvergill Adept out first so that you can actually cast it, because there's no guarantee that you'll draw another Merfolk if you cast that Lord, and then you'll be stuck with a dead card in your hand. So kind of on talking about Silvergill Adept, I have this comment here: Silvergill Adept is overpowered. And of course I'm joking, it's not overpowered, but only sort of. It's one of the best cards in Merfolk, and it's kind of under the radar good. You might look at it and think, you know, it doesn't do anything completely broken, it's just a 2/1. But the fact that it's a 2/1 that draws a card when it comes into play is super important for Merfolk, because as I mentioned, we don't have a whole lot of card draw, and so and we have a lot of synergy in our Merfolk. So, you know, sometimes just that extra Lord or extra Curse Catcher in play can make all the difference. So being able to kind of draw that extra card is super good, as well as a 2/1 body that grows to a, you know, a 3/2 or a 4/3 when you get a Lord or 2 in play. It's just a very good value for its cost. Next is, don't forget that Cavern can't make blue to cast spells. So I've caught myself doing this before where you know, the way I tap my mana, I think I have mana open for Flusterstorm or something, and then I realize that you know, my Cavern can't get me there. And so just kind of be mindful, Cavern doesn't make blue except for the creatures. It also does not stop Mindbreak Trap. So if you're playing around Mindbreak Trap, just realize that even if you make your Merfolk uncounterable, Mindbreak Trap doesn't counter a spell, it exiles it. The next is Phantasmal Image can be used to copy an opponent's creature. I kind of mentioned this earlier when I was introducing the creatures. One of the great things about Phantasmal Image is just how flexible it is. So if your opponent is able to tinker like a Blightsteel Colossus into play, if they're playing Oath and they get you know, like Emrakul into play or a Grizzled Brand, you know, on your turn you might be able to, if it's the right call, you know, copy that creature and save yourself from losing. I've played Oath before where they've gotten a Blazing Archon into play, and I'm basically dead, except that I have Phantasmal Image and I'm able to copy it. So another reminder, Lords do not give themselves Island Walk. So just remember that if you are attacking into open mana, if you're relying on one Lord for Island Walk, you don't want to leave yourself open necessarily to a blowout where, you know, after you declare attackers, they destroy your Lord, and then all of a sudden they can block all of your other Merfolk. So if you're relying on one Lord for Island Walk, it's just something to keep in mind that they don't give themselves Island Walk. Or if you know, you played a Lord last turn and you have a Silvergill Adept and you want to, you know, attack in with all your creatures, don't think if you attack with your, you know, think about before attacking with that Lord, because it doesn't itself have Island Walk like your other creature does. So those are just some, you know, general tips that I've found by playing the deck. So after that, I think what we'll do is talk about all of the various matchups that you might see if you're playing in Vintage right now. This is kind of reflective of the current meta. So, you know, when you're watching this video, it kind of, you know, how relevant these are going to be is going to depend on what cards come out in the future, what the meta looks like in the future, what the banned and restricted list looks like. But because Vintage is kind of a slow-moving format, my guess is that a lot of this information is probably going to be relevant for a while. So if we talk about shops, it's the most popular deck in the format right now. It has a strong resource denial strategy, runs like Trinisphere, Spear Resistance, Thorn, Tanglewire, you know, Revokers, Wasteland, Strip Mine. Just a lot of cards that are meant to limit your resources. And what they have is Mishra's Workshop and Ancient Tomb, which accelerate that lock into play, but also break the symmetry. So while they are flush with mana and able to get around their sphere effects, if all you're playing with is like islands, you know, it's going to be a lot harder for you to cast spells than for them. And then they also have artifact creatures like Arcbound Ravager and Walking Ballista that have, you know, multiple uses that can also be difficult for Merfolk to deal with. So especially Walking Ballista, which is able to kind of clear your board. So the strategy I found for playing shops is to use Force of Will early, try to you know, counter their important lock pieces. You know, if it's just a Sphere of Resistance, you know, you have to evaluate that. But if it is, say, like Trinisphere, maybe it's going to be very hard for you to play around Trinisphere. If they're playing Tanglewire, if you only have 1 or 2 permanents out, it could be very hard to play around Tanglewire. You know, those are the kinds of cards you want to force. Walking Ballista. But then also, you know, depending on how it's playing out, you know, Wasteland or Mishra's Workshop, that's sort of a catch-22 because if they are trying to establish that lock, you might want enough lands to be able to play through it. But if it looks like they are really limited in their own mana, then you might want to Wasteland that Workshop, especially if they played it and didn't do a whole lot with it. Like if they just played a like Foundry Inspector or something and don't have a lock into place yet, you know, maybe you want to Wasteland it. So, and then True Name Nemesis can be very strong in the matchup. It can't be targeted by a Ballista. It can block like Lodestone Golem. None of their stuff has trample, so it can become a good blocker. But it can also get through those bigger creatures and hopefully get in for lethal, you know, if you're able to turn the corner and do that. So after, so here's kind of the sideboarding plan on the left. Normally what I do is I'd bring in 3 Dismember. I would bring in 3 Hurkyl's Recall, 2 Steel Sabotage, and a Ghost Quarter. So Dismember kills most of their creatures. It might not kill like a Worm Coil that comes into the sideboard, but pretty much anything else it's able to handle. It has, you know, 3 Hurkyl's Recall, kind of talked about earlier. They play a lot of artifacts, and most of their creatures are artifacts. And so if you're able to end of turn Hurkyl's Recall them, it's sort of like a time walk. And forces them to kind of reset their board, and hopefully you're going to be able to, you know, kind of unload your hand and then put them on their back foot. Steel Sabotage is a great way to fight like a Walking Ballista or any other artifacts on the stack, but it can also return it to their hand if you need to. And then Ghost Quarter, just another way to interact with like Mishra's Workshop or a Mishra's Factory, but also a way to kind of get around that mana denial and give you another mana source to be able to cast your spells. What you could expect from them after Sideboard is possibly more Dismembers and Wormcoil Engine. Wormcoil Engine is going to be very hard for our deck to beat, and so just kind of something to think about. So that's shops. Mentor. So Blue-White Mentor, most commonly it's Jeskai Mentor, but basically they're a control deck. We're slightly unfavored in the matchup. Mentor is a heck of a card, and if they're able to resolve one and play a bunch of cheap spells, then it's kind of really hard to come back from. So Mentor being their key win condition, and then Jace the Mind Sculptor is kind of another win condition. They also have Baby Jace, which can win the game, and some other small creatures like Snapcaster Mage they might have. So they don't have to win through Monastery Mentor, but most of the time a Mentor deck is going to win by Mentor. So they basically control the game until Mentor can close it out, and they can get significant card advantage through like Gush and all of their cantrips and Library of Alexandria and all these other cards. And then they are also flushed with counter spells to just kind of delay that game until they're able to land a Mentor and then protect it. And so they can use Jace to slow the game down, bump your creatures to your hand, remove creatures with Swords of Plowshares, Pyroblast. Most lists I've seen lately run Balance. And so it's just something to think about. Maybe don't overextend if you don't have to. And so the strategy that I found is Cavern of Souls and True Name Nemesis are two of your strongest cards. So if you're able to play Merfolk with Cavern of Souls, it's a lot stronger than if you can't. Try to limit their Gush with land destruction. This was more important before Gush was restricted again. But it used to be the case that if they had two islands, it always like made you feel really bad because you'd want to spend your Wasteland, but you didn't know they had Gush, and then you'd target a land with Wasteland, and then they would Gush, and then bury you in card advantage. And so now it's restricted, it's not as big of a deal, but it's something to keep in mind that you might want to keep them off of Gush mana. And then just try to play multiple threats and stretch the resources early. So definitely not a game that favors us if it goes long. So you kind of want to get out there, build a board presence, and race them. Not much sideboarding to do. Again, the Dismembers are very strong against Mentor. It's a great way to answer Mentor for 1 mana, and 2 Phyrexian mana. But so I'd basically bring in 3 Dismember, and I always take out Null Rod. It doesn't do a whole lot in their deck. It'll hit the mocks that they actually do run, and Black Lotus, and sometimes they run like the Divining Top, and so it could stop that, but for the most part it's a pretty weak card in the matchup, and so that's what I side out in this matchup. Next we'll talk about, and I didn't include one for that blue control deck, just again because that's such a broad archetype with a couple different types of strategies. I didn't really kind of want to like try to come up with like a single way to approach that deck. I think the sideboarding strategy is just going to depend on what their deck is kind of built around, and so you can kind of use some of these other decks as like a guide. So if they do happen to run Mentor in that blue-white control deck, you want to bring in Dismembers. If they look like they can tinker to Time Vault or Voltaic Key, you want to leave your Null Rods in stuff, and probably bring in like Steel Sabotage, so stuff like that. But so in this case, we'll talk about that 4th most popular deck, Blue-Red Delver. It's a tempo deck. I haven't had a whole lot of experience playing against it yet, but just my gut feeling is that's probably pretty even. I'm kind of basing that off of the other Delver decks that I've played in the past. Blue-Red Delver obviously is gonna they win through Delver of Secrets, and I kind of put Eidolon of the Great Rebel as another key win condition. But they also run Scab Clan Berserker. They run Harsh Mentor, and you know, they're all kind of similar to Eidolon in that they can deal that incremental damage without even having to attack, and can make it difficult to cast some spells that you might want to, like Ancestor Recall or Dismember. You know, so Dismember is already a painful card if you're casting it for 4 life. You know, if you tack on 1 or 2 triggers from like Eidolon type cards, then all of a sudden, you know, it just kind of puts you in an unwinnable position where you have to remove a creature, but you're dealing yourself, you know, 8 damage to do it. So, so in general, they play an aggressive game with cheap creatures like Delver's Secrets, Eidolon, Mentor, Berserker, and then they combine that with a balanced suite of control and removal. So they're a pretty well-rounded deck, and they're just meant to get out there fast, put some things into play that can make it very difficult for you to do what you're trying to do while presenting a strong clock, and then use their counter spells and removal to just kind of protect that board state, prevent you from comboing out or something, and then win the game. So for Merfolk, the strategy would be similar to other blue decks that run a lot of counter spells. Cavern of Souls is very strong. True Name Nemesis is very strong in this matchup because it can prevent them from attacking if you need to use it as a blocker, but also gets around all the blockers they can make or play. So with Island, because they're a blue deck and they have to run islands, Island Walk is automatic with a Lord in play. And so since you run twice as many creatures, a good strategy for playing like Delver is to keep their board clear, even if it means trading your own creatures, because while they might be running around 15 creatures, you're running around 30. So, you know, trading your creatures 1 for 1 is just going to benefit you because it's more likely that you're going to be able to build your board up after than they will. So in terms of sideboarding, bringing in Dismember is strong. They do have some creatures like Delver. We don't have flying, so it can be very hard to block or deal with the Delver Secrets. And Eidolon of the Great Revel, most of our cards cost 3 mana or less. Maybe all of them with the exception of Force of Will, if I'm thinking right. So Eidolon can be very devastating, so you want answers to those cards, and Dismember is a very good answer for that. And of course, taking out Null Rod, being just blue-red, they don't run all the mocks, and they don't really rely on any artifacts. I can imagine maybe they run like Umzao's Jitte in the sideboard. If that's the case, I'd probably still even just try to rely on like Force of Will or dismembering a creature when they're trying to equip it or something. Then, you know, having Null Rod, which will probably just be a dead card. For them, after sideboard, you might expect a few more removal spells or counter spells, but I didn't really see anything when I was looking at these deck lists that were like definite tons of game against Merfolk. So just a little bit more of what they're already trying to do. Next we have Eldrazi. This is another prison aggro deck, sort of like Mud or Shops. And again, this one I feel is even, probably a little bit more even than Shops is. So similar to Shops, they have a strong resource denial strategy where they have like Thorn of Amethyst, Phyrexian Revokers, Thalias, etc. And what I think makes Merfolk a little bit better against Eldrazi than Shops is that a lot of their mana denial is stuff that we don't really care about. So instead of playing like Sphere of Resistance, they're playing like Thalia. Well, we're a creature-based deck, so that's not going to hurt us very much. You know, another benefit is that they run, on their side, they run Ancient Tomb and Eldrazi Temple to break the symmetry, and then they also run Cavern of Souls, which prevents countering their creatures. So that can be a troublesome card, Cavern of Souls, because it can make our Force of Wills dead. They have additional hate-type creatures like Containment Priest and Eldrazi Displacer, and Thought-Knot Seer and Reality Smasher are powerful threats that are fairly cheap that can close the game really quickly. So it's a little bit more aggressive than Shops. Our strategy is to just try to wasteland their soul lands. You know, it's difficult for them to pay their high cost spells like Reality Smasher and Thought-Knot Seer without those soul lands like Eldrazi Temple and Ancient Tomb. And so trying to limit their mana in that way can be smart. And then True Name Nemesis, again, similar to Shops. Most of their stuff doesn't have trample except for Reality Smasher, so a True Name Nemesis can be on defense, you know, and block you know, Reality Smasher or Thought Not Seer. It can't block a Reality Smasher, but you might be able to trade. You know, if you have like a Lord and your True Nemesis. So True Nemesis is good. For sideboarding, you know, it's a creature-based deck, so bring in 3 Dismember. It handles all their creatures, including Reality Smasher. Ghost Quarter, again, because they really rely on those soul lands. And then take out Mental Misstep. Mental Misstep is bad in the matchup. They don't have a whole lot of 1-drops. And then take out a Flusterstorm, because you're not really going to have many like counter wars or anything with a deck that doesn't run those cards. So from their side, after sideboard, you can probably expect Dismember to come in, and then you might see some Swords to Plowshares. Next on the list is Oath of Druids. This is a control combo deck. I have the matchup listed as unfavored. We're a creature deck. We can't win without playing creatures. We want to be playing creatures from turn 1. And so Oath of Druids is a combo where if you have Oath of Druids and your opponent has a creature in play, you get to do this very powerful thing. Well, just by being Merfolk, we're already sort of fulfilling 1/2 of their combo for them. And so it can be a very difficult matchup, especially main board, because we don't really have any answer to a resolved Oath trigger except for one main board Echoing Truth. And so typically what they win with is Grizzlebrand or Emrakul. I have Sun Titan listed here because there's a version with Saheeli Ray where if they have a Saheeli Ray in play and a Saheeli Ray in the graveyard, which they're likely to do after their Oath trigger resolves, then when they put a Sun Titan into play, they can copy that Sun Titan with the Saheeli that they own on the board already, and then use that Sun Titan trigger to return the one from the graveyard. That comes into play. The other one, the one that's already in play, goes to the graveyard, and then they're able to do that as many times as they want and generate a hasty army of Sun Titans, which can be very difficult to deal with. So, but yeah, basically, Oath of Druids is a control deck that they basically want to find, play, and protect Oath of Druids. Sometimes as early as turn 1, and then, like I said, put Grizzlebrand, Emrakul, Sun Titan into play, and then Oath requires you to have a creature, so they run a land, Forbidden Orchard, that can force you to have a creature because it gives you a creature when they tap it for mana. So a good strategy against them is to apply pressure while just trying to prevent the opponent from finding or playing Oath of Druids. So most of the time the deck can't win without Oath of Druids, so that should be your priority number 1. So don't put yourself into a position trying to get greedy and establishing a board or something if you have an answer to Oath in play or in hand, because all it takes is for them to resolve that Oath, and it can be very difficult for you to win. So for sideboarding, basically bring in the 4 Grafdigger's Cage. I would probably mull at least once to find one, unless you have like a super good hand that you can counter an Oath of Druids with, and then take out Nullrod and Dismember. Nullrod is either hit or miss against Oath of Druids. They run a lot of the Mox and like Black Lotus, but just how good Nullrod is depends on whether they find those cards or not. So it's very situational. It can be very good or very bad, and so I like to take it out. And then I take out 1 Dismember because it doesn't handle any of their creatures. It can't kill a Grizzlebrand. It can't kill an Emrakul, obviously. It's not even big enough to kill Blazing Archon. So, speaking of which, after sideboard, I always expect Blazing Archon. Against other creature decks, that's what they usually bring in. It's 5/6, so you can't kill it with Dismember, and then it has flying, so you're not able to block it. So, and then all they have to do is kind of survive for a couple turns if you can't find an answer, and they're able to beat in and kill you. So, yeah, basically Oath of Druids, just prevent them from playing Oath of Druids, and you should be fine. But that's easier said than done. So after Oath, we'll kind of hit some of the other matchups that weren't on that list of the meta that we talked about, but that are also very popular and often find themselves in the position of one of the most popular decks in the format. They just don't happen to be right now. So first on the list is Storm. There's a couple different versions of Storm. There's the Dark Petition Storm, and then there's the Paradoxical Outcome Storm. I'm kind of listing both of these together, even though they're fairly different decks. but they're a combo deck. I think we're favored against them. Their key win conditions are Tendrils of Agony, or sometimes they have a Tinker into Blightsteel Colossus plan. And basically what they try to do is they play a ton of free or cheap spells that net excess mana, like the Mox, the Mana Rocks, like Dark Ritual, and then they generate a large storm count. And they have spells like Time Twister, Wheel of Fortune, Paradoxical Outcome that draw several cards and keep that chain going. And then eventually they find Tendrils of Agony and are able to cast it with a storm count of at least 9 and kill you. So I kind of mentioned many of the decks have a Tinker and Blightsteel Colossus plan B. So our strategy is to use Mental Misstep on cantrips or rituals or mana rocks, use Force of Will on large draw spells like Time Twister or Paradoxical Outcome, and save Fluster Storm for Tendrils of Agony. Landing an Null Rod can be game winning. I kind of mentioned they need to play that high density of spells that also generate mana, and so preventing them from playing any of their Moxen or their other artifact rocks is often just backbreaking for them. So in terms of sideboarding, take out the Dismember because they generally don't run any creatures. I take out Echoing Truth. Maybe if you think they're going to tinker into Blightsteel, you could think about that, but what we're bringing in is 2 Steel Sabotage. One, because it can counter like a Mana Vault or one of their Mana Rocks. I guess in a pinch, you could bounce one of their Mana Rocks to their hand and prevent them from drawing 1 extra card with Paradoxical Outcome, although that doesn't seem super great. But it's also, if they do go into that plan B, Tinker into Blightsteel Colossus, Steel Sabotage is able to bump that back to their hand. And hopefully, if you're able to get like a Null Rod into play or something, they won't have the mana to be able to cast that. So after sideboard, what they are going to bring in is probably Defense Grid if they're not already running it in the main board. And so just be aware of that, because if you have a handful of Force of Wills or Flusterstorm and you think you're in a good position, you just need to be aware of the fact that they might be able to play Defense Grid and just kind of turn those all into dead cards. Next is Landstill. So this is a control deck. In my experience, we're favored. Their key win conditions are Mishra's Factory and Jace the Mind Sculptor, or Emrakul, the Living End. So they're basically a control strategy that gains significant card advantage from Standstill. And so once they have a Standstill in play, it puts you in a difficult position, because if you cast any spell, they get to draw 3 cards. And so, and that can give them a significant advantage. And they play Wasteland and Strip Mine together with Crucible of the Worlds to limit opponents' mana. And then they often play Moat in the main board, which is probably the most significant thing for Merfolk to think about. And so Mishra's Factory, if it's in play, still lets them attack, even if they have a standstill in play, so they don't have to be casting more spells. They can just play Mishra's Factory and begin applying pressure. And so our strategy, again, Cavern of Souls and True Name Nemesis are 2 of the strongest cards, because they do run a lot of counter magic, and they don't run a whole lot of answers besides their 4 Swords to Plowshares to our creatures. And so being able to make sure that Cavern of Souls gets our creatures onto the board is important. True Name Nemesis can't be bounced by Jace, which is super important in the matchup, because they usually try to land a Jace as well. And then, like I kind of mentioned, watch for Swords of Plowshares during combat. Be wary of Moat and Supreme Verdict mana. When you're choosing what to Wasteland or Strip Mine, you'll often want to look and see, do they have 2 white? If they don't have 2 white, or if you're able to limit them from having 2 white by, using Wasteland or Strip Mine, then that's something you probably want to do, because most of them run at least 1 Supreme Verdict in the main board, and will often bring in an extra one after sideboarding. One thing I've noticed is that don't necessarily be afraid to play in a standstill if needed. We can become a very fast deck, especially if we're playing through their counter spells like with Cavern of Souls, and are able to mental misstep their Swords of Plowshares. And so even if they draw all these cards, sometimes they're not able to respond to our fast clock, even with all those cards. So with sideboarding, I bring in a Ghost Quarter. It's just another answer to their Mistress Factory. Same thing with Dismember, can answer those factories, and they don't have that many win conditions besides those factories. And then I just take out the 3 Null Rod because they don't really have a whole lot of artifacts that matter in their deck besides the Mox, and so those are kind of dead cards. So after Sideboard, from their perspective, expect Moat if you didn't see it in the first game. They probably will bring in or have extra copies of Supreme Verdict and maybe some more removal that they didn't have in the main board. Next up is Dredge. So Dredge is a combo deck. It's sort of the boogeyman of the format. Merfolk is unfavored against it. The way that they win is they use Bridge from Below to generate like a huge zombie army, and then they use that zombie army to or other cards that find their way into play to cast Dread Return and return either Kolagon or like Flamekin Zealot, although I think Kolagon is a lot more popular now, and give all their creatures haste and attack in like the turn that they're comboing out. So they abuse Bazaar of Baghdad to quickly dredge their library with like Golgari Grave Troll, Stinkweed Imp, Golgari Thug, and when they dredge, they flip creatures in their graveyard like Narcomoeba and Bloodghast that are able to return into play from the graveyard, and then they can use those, sacrifice them to play Cabal Therapy, strip your hand of anything relevant, and at the same time get triggers from Bridge from Below that they've hopefully dredged as well to generate a huge zombie army, and then use that to cast Dread Return and bring in that finishing creature like Dragonlord, Kolagon, or sometimes even like Elish Norn, which is also very difficult for our deck to handle. And so our strategy would be to Wasteland or Strip Mine their Bazaar of Baghdad. The deck is much, much worse without Bazaar, and so Wastelanding or Strip Mining their Bazaar is one of our best ways to beat the deck. And then Curse Catcher, an interesting interaction is if they are able to get a Narcomoeba or like a Bloodghast into play, and they sack it to Cabal Therapy to generate some tokens. If you have a Curse Catcher in play, you can actually sacrifice that to exile all the Bridge Belows in their graveyard before those triggers resolve. And so that's something to keep in mind, that Curse Catcher is actually a very valuable card in the matchup because you're able to, at instant speed, exile all those Bridge from Belows and prevent them from getting that big zombie army. For sideboarding, if you're paying your tax like you should be for Dredge, you should have several cards to bring in. We have 4 Grafdigger's Cages, some Tormod's Crypt, and a Ghost Quarter. All those cards are very good in the matchup, so those come in. I take out my 4 True Name Nemesis. It's just a slower card. It's a lot better against like those fair matchups, and so against Dredge it's just too slow. So I take out True Name Nemesis and then take out the Null Rods because they don't have any artifacts that do anything, and so Null Rod's just a dead card. And so after Sideboard, what you might expect to see from them are, depending on how the deck is built, maybe anti-hate cards like Ignite Chewer or Nature's Claim that could target your Grafdigger's Cage, or a Dark Depths transformative sideboard. If you're playing Pitch Dredge, which you'll see, because you will see like Force of Will and Mental Misstep in their main board, then you might expect them to transition in this Dark Depths sideboard plan. In which case, Ghost Quarters is also important to sort of answer that Dark Depths or Thespian stage. And then our last deck we'll talk about is Grixis Thieves. I've noticed this one becoming more popular on MTGO lately. So it's a control combo deck. We are favored in the matchup, I've found. Their key win conditions are Time Vault and Blightsteel Colossus that they can tinker for. Part of what kind of gives us an edge is that we are a Null Rod deck, so game 1 we already have a good answer to their Time Vault plan. And we have a pretty fast clock. So synopsis is that they're a control deck, that they usually win through Time Vault and Voltaic Key combo or by tinkering for Blightsteel Colossus. They play additional permission control with like several copies of Mana Drain, and they can gain significant card advantage with Notion Thief. So you have to be wary if you're going for an Ancestral Recall and they have like Notion Thief mana up. And Notion Thief also plays very well with Dak Faden, which is sort of a staple of the deck, where they can make you draw cards and then discard 2. With Dak Faden, if they have Notion Thief in play, then they get to draw 2 cards and you discard 2 cards. So that's just a very, very good interaction. Our strategy is generally just be aggressive and save counterspells for Tinker or the Time Vault combo if you can. Because if they're removing your creatures or trading for your creatures with Notion Thieves or Snapcaster Mages, you'll always draw more creatures. We're a very creature-dense deck. Whereas they can just kind of win on the spot with a Tinker or like Time Vault Voltaic Key. And so you want to make sure that you're saving your counter spells for those really key spells if you can. So I would just bring in 2 Steel Sabotage. Again, it's a good way to counter a Time Vault or Voltaic Key. It's a good answer to a Blightsteel Colossus that finds its way into play. And then I would just take out a Dismember. There aren't a whole lot of key creatures that they run that we have to worry about killing. And a Phantasmal Image. Just because it's a little bit slower and they have a lot of cards that target. So against any deck that has a lot of cards that can target, like Baby Jace or Big Jace, or all sorts of removal like Pyroblast or Lightning Bolt or Sudden Shock, or all these different types of cards, Phantasmal Image gets a little bit worse because it's not likely to stick around. So those are some of the more popular matchups. There's definitely a lot more decks out there, but these are pretty common to what I see, and I think they span a broad enough range of archetypes that some of the sideboarding plans are kind of you'd be able to apply to some of the different types of decks you'd see. So after that, we'll kind of go over like my personal results. I do log all my matches. So with Merfolk specifically, since I started playing it back in August, I've played 68 matches with it online. It's kind of a mix of daily events and just in the practice room. And you can see overall I have a pretty good match win percentage. 66%, that means I'm winning 2/3 of my matches. And it doesn't seem to matter whether I'm on the play or the draw for that, which is kind of a good thing to think about. You don't necessarily have to win the die roll to have an edge in the matchup. Although obviously you would want to win the die roll. But I think what's sort of important to look at are the mulligan statistics. You can see that I mulligan 22.8% of my matches, or of my games. That's an N of 171 games. So that basically means 1 out of every 5 opening hands I have to mulligan, which isn't actually that bad. And part of that is just because we're a mono blue deck, so I can't really get choked on having the wrong type of mana. We run 19 lands and 2 fast mana, so we have a lot of mana sources, so it's very rare that I have to mulligan due to no mana. And then we're very redundant in our creatures, and so most of the time it doesn't really matter what creatures I have in hand, as long as I have a couple, it's a good enough hand to keep. So the deck doesn't mulligan that often. And then what you can see is that if you look at the column with game win percentage for 1 mulligan, it's still 60%. And so we do lose a little bit of an edge by mulliganing, but not very much, because if we look at our game statistics, our overall game win percentage is 61.4%. And so with 1 mulligan, it just goes down to 60%. That basically means that the deck mulligans very well. And so you shouldn't be afraid to mulligan if you don't think your hand is good enough to get there and you're pretty sure you can draw into a better one. But then you can see with 2 mulligans, our match win, our game win percentage goes down to 33.3%, and so that is obviously much worse. And so any deck doesn't want to mulligan very much, except for Dredge. And so basically the information takeaway from this is that don't be afraid to mulligan. 1 mulligan is fine, but start thinking about it pretty hard if you have to do more than 1. And so kind of using these match win percentage, like I said, it's a mix of dailies and practice results. I've played 4 dailies in it. I don't get to play them very often, so I don't have a very large data set for that. But I have gone 3-1 3 times and then 2-2 that 4th time. So, whether it's practice matches or matches, and dailies, I found the deck actually performs pretty well. And so kind of with that in mind, if you're looking at a deck to kind of grind with, or you know, you just want to like get a return on your investment, if you have a 66.2% match win percentage, if you go to GoatBots, they'll actually calculate what your expected EV is depending on what event you get into. You can see that you end up positive on the vintage dailies. So on average, you should net around 10 tickets per daily. And so obviously there's going to be times you go 2-2 or 1-3 or even 0-4, but you can kind of see over here that we have, you know, that's about a 40% chance of not cashing out and about a 60% chance of cashing out. So if you play enough of them and you get good enough with the deck, you know, I think it's definitely a good enough deck to hang with the all the other decks in the format. And you know, I think that's a lot of fun to play. It has a lot of lines. It's a very fair deck, and so you kind of feel like you earn most of your wins. And so you know, for that reason, it's kind of one of my favorite decks in the format. And yeah, so I you know, it's definitely a deck that I would recommend to anybody looking to get into the format. So especially if you already own it from Modern or Legacy. So that's the deck tech. If you like it, feel free to leave some positive feedback on the video, or if you have any comments or questions, I might start like a mana drain thread after I post this to you know, incorporate all that discussion and try to link it to the video. But yeah, so thanks for watching. Maybe I'll do a couple more of these for other decks, but in the meantime, if you end up playing Merfolk, hope you have fun, and catch you later.